Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
And I'm Chris Clements. Sean, good to have you back.
Thanks. Good to
Missed
be back.
you last week.
Yeah,
we ranted, but there was
California.
like this little delay that I noticed on the broadcast.
Yes.
It's not the same. It's not the same without the two of us
Sitting next to each
other, bantering away.
Yeah. Well, we're honored to have a repeat guest. We have Rich Thau of Engagious here with us today to talk about, a little bit of everything. But Rich, welcome back.
Great to be back. Thank you.
So you've been doing a series of focus groups across the country. What do you do these each month? Is that
One, yes, two focus groups each month, and each time in a different swing state.
And so it's been a few months since we had you. What
are you seeing these days?
What's going on? Where have you been lately, and what shifted, and what has become evident to you as we are in the last 6.5 weeks of the campaign?
So a couple of things have shifted. I'd say the first thing that shifted, and we heard really for the first time this month, we did groups across North Carolina on September 12th, was a little bit of a bounce back for President Biden. You know, his poll numbers nosedived the summer of 21 and basically remained pretty bad and pretty flat for a year. And they've been ticking up a little bit. And I wanted to know whether people had detected that and whether they felt that. Because the people I talked to would be the ones who'd be the reason why these numbers were ticking back up. You know, they're the persuadable voters. They voted Trump in 2016, then Biden in 20. So they're your classic swing voters. And in fact, I asked them, I said, how many of you just fit this description of you were with him in the beginning, and then your support for him dropped. And then in the last month or so, you've kind of started seeing him more positively again. And it turned out a more than half of our respondents said that they had felt that way. And when I asked them the reason, they started saying things like, well, the gas prices had started going back down. The student loan forgiveness was something they saw positively. They liked that, even if it didn't necessarily benefit them themselves. They liked the fact he was doing that, and they were seeing action from him. He seemed engaged, which was really eye-opening because I'd heard a long earful of negativity out of these people. And I want to be clear about something. These aren't people who are in love with Joe Biden. These are people for whom Biden is marginally better than Trump. So for them to say anything positive, that's a real plus for Biden. And I obviously not everybody listening to this broadcast is in love with Joe Biden, but people should know what I'm hearing. And that's one thing that I'm hearing. The other big thing that I've been focusing on is what the Dobbs decision means in these midterms. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time in this session asking these respondents about Dobbs. So these were all, again, North Carolina voters, just recently, September 12th. And for them, the Dobbs decision changed their calculus, at least for a number of them. And it did it in a variety of different ways. One, it took some people who really just focus on the candidates and look at them as individuals, and instead for some of them to look at their party affiliation. And I should be clear, and this is interesting too, when I've been asking about this decision over the last several months, nearly all of these respondents are pro-choice. They're not pro-life. So just keep this in mind. These are people who voted for Trump in 2016, despite Trump's being avowedly pro-life. Mm-hmm. So the issue didn't matter so much to them that they voted for Clinton, because they didn't. They voted for Trump and accepted Trump's pro-life position. So looking at this election, I'm thinking to myself, abortion didn't matter terribly much in 2016. I don't know how much it mattered, particularly for them in 2020. People tend not to say that they switched from Trump to Biden because of abortion. It was because of the pandemic and other things. But in this election, this midterm election, I was sort of wondering what's happening for them. And they're saying things to me like they thought the decision was too extreme. It was taking away their freedoms, particularly this particular freedom. They didn't like the fact that in some sort of extreme circumstance, a woman couldn't choose to terminate a pregnancy if she wanted to. So it sounds like these people are sort of, again, avowedly, abortion on demand types. They're not. They can see a fairly nuanced and have a fairly nuanced position on the issue, but they don't like the fact that Roe was overturned. It really bothered them. And in this race, a number of them said they were going to vote for Sherry Beasley over Ted Budd, the Senate race in North Carolina, because of this particular issue. It really mattered to them. Fewer of them, although some said inflation and the economy was going to be a voting issue. And the other big voting issue for them was Trump and whether Trump was endorsing one of these candidates. And obviously he's endorsing Budd. Mm-hmm. So you got to be very careful sort of to understand where these people are, because they're all in a somewhat slightly different position from each other. But the main thrust, I would say, is that abortion has risen as a voting issue and as a concern for them. I would not say it's the top issue. When I ask an open-ended question, what's the number one issue that matters most to you in America right now? Only one of the 11 people in North Carolina said that abortion was their top issue. But when I gave them a list of 17 issue positions, one of them being protecting a woman's right to choose, another one being protecting the right to life, 9 of the 11 said that protecting a woman's right to choose was a top 3 issue for them. So, and that was the first month, by the way, where it was number 1. Inflation and the economy was 8 votes out of 11. So it sort of narrowly eked out sort of a first place showing, if you will. Abortion did as a top 3 issue. So things are shifting for these people. It's a very complicated calculus because, again, each person reacts somewhat differently. And we had a couple of people, I should say, in this session who said that they were sort of a coin toss on whether they'd vote or not. And they were clearly pro-choice. The issue mattered to them, but they don't typically vote in midterms. So it's like, well, maybe I'll vote, maybe I won't. So again, it's hard to judge exactly where this is going to go. I mean, clearly on balance, it favors the Democrats. But ultimately what the effect is going to be, that's anyone's guess.
Well, and it's a good question because it 2 questions. One, that whether or not they'll even vote, because being a presidential election voter doesn't necessarily make you a midterm voter, especially if you're in this swing crowd, because they're notorious for being finicky about whether they vote or not. And, especially in non-presidential years.
And they kind of make up their mind later in the cycle.
Yeah. And I find it fascinating that you have seen a uptick. I mean, it's not a surprise that abortion has become more of an issue for many voters. But it will be interesting to see how many decide that abortion is more important than inflation or other issues that are typically top tier when you look at polling, because this year is the first time in many years that abortion comes anywhere near the top among voters.
And what exactly, can you give a little bit of color in terms of what is happening in that state in terms of abortion legislation within the state? Because that's essentially what is going to skew people's perceptions and perspectives as well.
Maybe not. I mean, one of the things that the Democrats have done a very good job of from the moment the decision came down was saying that this is a radical decision. They're taking away a woman's right to choose, regardless of where you live. I mean, it clearly does not do that in New York or California or Illinois or other deep blue states. But they didn't. They smartly did not distinguish where that is, what happens in individual states.
Yeah, I guess that's
they tried to nationalize this is taking away a woman's right to choose, period.
Yeah, I guess that's the root of my question are you seeing any nuances in any of your focus groups as to, are people making any distinctions?
That's a great question, Chris. I think in North Carolina, the situation is that it's legal in North Carolina. And Republicans are just a few votes away from having a supermajority where they could impose more stringent abortion laws if Republicans gain the supermajority control in both houses, and they can override the governor. There were some of my respondents who were aware of that. It didn't seem to be the overriding consideration for them, but there were a few who were aware of it. But again, it wasn't like, oh my God, if we get to 3 here and 4 more there, that this is going to be radically different in North Carolina. They were looking at, I would say, to answer your question, I think in a much more national sense, and to who was going to have control over the Senate in particular. That was something that they were definitely in tune with. The other thing I would say to you, and you guys know I do this every month with these candidates, I put up on the screen during the focus group unidentified official photos of the candidates. So I had 11 respondents. 8 of them could recognize Sherry Beasley. Only 3 could identify Ted Butt.
Oh my God.
Okay, and I'm not done yet. When I said to the respondents, these 2 people are running for an office, who could tell me who's in that office now? Whose job would they take if they win the election? 0 out of 11 could tell me who their current U.S. senator is, who's retiring after 18 years in that role.
Well, Richard Burr was always very much a low-key type of a guy.
Fading into the wallpaper, yes. So that was so you get a sense of where respondents are on these elections, and this is another thing I've been finding month over month, is that unless the person is already famous, like Dr. Oz, for example, or Herschel Walker, within weeks of an upcoming election, most of these people can't identify an unlabeled photograph of the leading candidate for Senate or governor.
Well, that points out
once again, the man on the street.
Right. Well, it points out a very important aspect of this, and that is you look at the millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on TV ads in each of these Senate campaign states where there's Senate campaigns. These are the voters who make the difference in these elections. They're clearly not watching TV. Because if you're in North Carolina and you watch TV, you know who these people are.
Sure.
Because you see their ads constantly.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So most of these people do get news from television and also online. So they are targetable. They're getting them. All these people get their news from a variety of different sources. A number of them get it just from local news sources, local TV stations, for example. But to me, what's so stunning about this is that either they're seeing the ads or they're not. And if they are seeing the ads, are they paying attention?
Right. Yeah.
Or are they speeding through the ads? Fast forwarding through them? Are they just zoning out? Are they looking at their phones during commercials? I think there's just a lot to me, I'm just so intrigued by this because it's an endless phenomenon of people not knowing who the candidates are in elections. And I saw the same thing during the Democratic primaries before the 2020 election. People had no idea who some of the most famous politicians in America are. to not be able to identify Bernie Sanders, for example, or Elizabeth Warren. Again, some of you like or dislike them. I mean, they're famous, right? I mean, to us, they're famous. To people listening to this, they're famous. Whether you like or most dislike them,
though. We're not normal.
But that is fascinating.
Anyway.
That is.
We talked about with David Schweiker here a couple weeks ago that going after those persuadables, the swing voters, which you highlight so spectacularly. Politicians forget this, and it seems like the politicians that fall aside or lose an election, they focus so much on their party, focus so much on the people who will vote for them, and not go after folks like the concerns and the issues of swing voters and the persuadables.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, and it just shows the chasm between the political class and everybody else, and you kind of understand why so many people are so frustrated, and because the dialogue is just it's out of sync.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, most people say, "Well, my representative doesn't care about me. He doesn't understand who I am, what my life is like, and it could have to do with abortion, could have to do with inflation, could have to do with any number of different issues, and the majority of the time they're right. They're right. The most politicians are not focused on persuadable. People who look at an election, the last 2 weeks of a cycle, and finally start paying attention. And that's just the sad part of our body politic.
Now, Rich, you were in North Carolina most recently.
Yeah.
Where were you the month before that?
Florida.
Oh, okay. Interesting. What do we know from Florida? What was your big takeaway for there?
My big takeaway was that these swing voters do not care for DeSantis and do not care for Rubio. They both carry a lot of baggage. So I would not be surprised if these elections for those two positions are closer than people expect. I mean, the polling is showing close races. I would not be surprised that if these are both very close races down there. Rubio has the advantage of being better recognized, at least at the time I did the groups. Nearly all of them could identify a photo of Rubio. About half of them could identify a photo of Val Demings, the Democratic congresswoman who's running against him. Mm-hmm. Charlie Crist and Ron DeSantis are very well recognized by people in Florida. They know who they are. So that's also going to be, I think, a pretty close race. And there's just a lot of frustration, in particular with DeSantis. And by the way, these folks do not want to see him as president of the United States ever. Right. They specifically asked about that. And it's not because they love him so much they want him to stay in Florida. It's because they don't care for him. So I don't want to sound like Debbie Downer to a more conservative audience here, but I've been hearing just a lot of frustration with the Republican candidates across the board throughout all of these sessions. And again, it's not because of a love of the Democrats, but it's much more frustration. I mean, what I heard in April in Pennsylvania with Dr. Oz, I don't know if I did a show with you after that, but one of the respondents described him as the TV character Dexter.
Oh, geez.
He creeped him out. Yeah. So, and when I asked for adjectives to describe him, they were just relentlessly negative. So, yeah, well, it's tough. I mean, but right now, I'll tell you, Fetterman is getting pilloried right now on crime in Pennsylvania. Right. And it's Oz and the Republicans who are going after it. So I'm curious to see what impact that has. And also, Fetterman has a lot of issues, obviously, with his health. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we haven't had a press conference with his doctors telling us that he is capable of serving a grueling 6-year term as a U.S. senator from the arguably most competitive swing state in America. You know, that's a tough position to have. And so I think there is a lot of vulnerabilities that Fetterman's facing and he hasn't really had to own up to while Oz was failing to attack him. Now Oz and the Republicans and outside groups are attacking relentlessly. I'm curious to see whether that moves Fetterman's numbers at all, especially in a place like Pennsylvania where crime is a huge issue, particularly in and around Philadelphia.
Yeah. Fetterman's problem, I think, at this point is that Joe Biden is president. And what I mean by that is...
It's not the lump on the back of his neck.
No, it's the question about his mental capacity is it looms much larger as a result of all the questions about the mental capacity of the occupant in the White House. This would be less of an issue, I think, if we didn't have a Biden presidency right now that was in question about, is he all there?
But also the severity of his health is, it seems like it's being dismissed, and that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate for him. It's unfortunate for the electorate because stroke is a major illness, and it's something that changes your entire life. Your entire brain function is either forever changed or you can absolutely rise above it over time. But as somebody myself who's suffered from silent stroke and has had to battle through some of these issues, I've never had a full-blown stroke, but I can only imagine and I'm not defending Fetterman as a candidate per se, but I can only imagine how difficult it is to try to give a speech or try to put a couple words together. And you're seeing him on some of the television coverage, he's blanking out or he's having a hard time finding the next word. I'm watching that. I get that. Yeah. I get that because there was a time in my life several years ago where a smaller incident happened to me. And so he's had a full-blown stroke. He shouldn't be running for public office. There's no way he can, to your point, there's no way he can do this job for 6 years. And Democrats are kind of dismissing it like, oh, well, it's really just an elected office. He'll be able to get the care he needs. It's like, no, this running for the U.S. Senate and then being a U.S. Senator is a big deal.
It should be a big deal.
And people who dismiss it do so at their peril. And hopefully the electorate in Pennsylvania will recognize that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Democrats had their choice in the primary. They could have chosen Connor Lamb, who's a very moderate Democrat, former Marine, chiseled good looks from the western part of the state, speaks absolutely flawlessly, clearly, and beautifully, and eloquently. And I think he ultimately would be a much more difficult opponent for Oz than Fetterman's proving to be.
I think Connor could have won that seat for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I don't even think we'd be having this discussion.
Connor Lamb's got to be just shaking his head right now going, what in the world?
Yeah.
This shouldn't even be a contest because it wouldn't be.
Well, and he was a guy who was respected by, everybody, right?
Yeah.
Well, people talk about the challenges of Republican candidates. Democrats have had some challenges as well.
Of course.
So,
yeah, Fetterman won people's hearts in Pennsylvania. That was the thing, for particularly people far left.
Yeah.
And the other thing that Fetterman benefits from, and we've seen this just very quickly on Fetterman, is that to me, he looks like a bouncer outside of some club. And so someone who doesn't know much about him, but just looks at him will think he's much more conservative than he is.
Yeah, great point.
And that's something that I think is really undervalued in the political discussion. But I've had focus group respondents look at him and go, oh, this guy's got to be, he's got to be a Trump guy. Look at him, with the tattoos and wearing the hoodie. And it's just, he's created this persona, which is confounding to a lot of people and is, I think, ultimately accrues to his benefit. But whether he pulls it off or not, who knows?
Yeah.
That is a gregreat point. I did not even consider that.
Yeah.
And Oz, by the way, I watched a speech of his on C-SPAN the other night. This is what I do for my fun time. I watched back-to-back Oz and Fetterman speeches on C-SPAN the other night. Oz gave to me what was a far better stump speech than I ever expected. I know he's telegenic, he's got a lot of experience, but he was a really solid speech. It showed, first, he was eloquent. Second, he had a command of the issues. He had the speech not only well thought out in terms of what he wanted to say, but the sequencing of his arguments and the way he pulled them together. It was a very, very solid speech. It wasn't sort of a barn burner, stem winding type of thing, but it was well received and he was clear in a way that I thought was surprising for a political novice. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Oz does better in this election than people think. Again, too close to call.
Yeah, sure. And, it's interesting you bring up Florida because there's a great article in the American Spectator I think today, by Larry Thornberry, highlighting this very issue. And one of the things that he highlights specifically is the fact that Rubio is at a cash disadvantage and has not done a good job of really defining Val Demings at all. And she's been on the air for now, blanking in the airways for some time. What other deficits do you see in that race, Republican versus Democrat?
Well, so what's really interesting to me is that Rubio came out and endorsed and became a co-sponsor of Lindsey Graham's abortion bill last week. And Val Demings, if she's on top of it, will go after him. I mean, obviously you saw what happened in the mainstream media with that bill and how it was seen as a wedge to separate Graham from a bunch of other Republicans in the Senate. The fact that Rubio lined up behind Graham is really intriguing to me. So, Rubio, I guess, feels like he knows his electorate well enough to be able to take this position and not get pilloried for it. But you're talking about a national 15-week ban of abortion. I think that's, given where the polling is on this, about 60% of Americans think abortion should be allowed in all or most cases. And I don't know how, as a senator in a swing state, you take that position that Rubio's taking without taking in some incoming. It seems to me like a vulnerability for him. And Val Demings, obviously being, former chief of police, being serious on crime, obviously, I think it's a tough thing to go after her on that issue, which is a huge issue also in Florida. So I don't know. I think Rubio is going to have a real challenge here, and fundraising is an issue, which it shouldn't be for a guy who's been in the Senate for 12 years, running for a third term. I mean, he should be swimming in cash.
Absolutely, that was the biggest surprise of the article for me, that he was at a huge cash disadvantage already going into the general, and that shouldn't have been the case. I mean, intuitively,
Right.
Yeah. So,
Rich, have you
all great points.
You did a group here in Arizona within the last few months, right?
I did Arizona in June or July.
Yeah, that's hot summer months. Good. Glad you did it by Zoom.
It was a little warm there. Yeah, it was.
Tell us a little bit about what your takeaways from that.
Wow. Okay. So,
do we want to hear this?
Well, it was before the
do.
primary, so
Yeah.
there's probably some nuances that have changed, I would guess. But
yeah, well, there was a general significant lack of familiarity with most of the candidates, even with your incumbent Senator Kelly. So that was, I think, an issue right there. I asked specifically about a couple of the ads and comments made by two of your candidates, Lake and Masters, that basically said that the 2020 election was stolen. And it was probably not a huge surprise among these Trump to Biden voters, who obviously all voted for Biden in 2020, that they thoroughly disagreed with the notion that the 2020 election was stolen. And they were troubled by the fact that candidates were making that argument. I had one person who said they trusted Lake, having seen her on TV for so many years, and that this probably wasn't a consideration for him, but he was the exception. I think for most of these people, sort of the election was stolen argument and still making it, even 2 years after the election was over, just isn't a winning argument. And this is something I think I should sort of stress for you and for your listeners. Part of it is, well, if you think, you look at the evidence that Biden won, and you come to the conclusion, well, it wasn't stolen. So, like, why are you making an argument that's patently not true? That's part of their thinking. The other thinking is, and I'd say it's arguably even more important, why are you relitigating something that happened 2 years ago?
Yeah.
What are you going to do for me now?
right,
And I think that's where you get into a lot of hot water, where when you embrace former President Trump so tightly in an attempt to hold on and grab onto his staunch supporters, that when you talk to the people I'm talking to, these swing voters, this is really off-putting. And I think these are folks who are future focused. They are suffering, and we haven't spoken much about this yet. We really should, over inflation. Even despite the fact that gas prices are coming down, they're still complaining bitterly about the grocery prices and prices for other goods. That's the conversation they want to have. And by the way, I've been telling you a lot about what the Republicans are doing wrong. Let me tell you some stuff about what Democrats are doing wrong. When I ask these people, what do you see the government doing to help bring prices down, inflation down? The response is not a single thing coming out of the White House. The only thing that they can name is the Federal Reserve raising interest rates.
which isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, when I ask them, like, what are you doing? The response is that.
Yeah, we talked about it last week. Arizona is ground zero for inflation.
Yeah,
13%. Here is up 13%.
Yeah. So
gas prices are not coming down.
Going back to your point about the stolen election issue, I think you're exactly right. With most voters who are not Trump loyalists, it is off-putting because it's like, what are you doing for me now? Because that has nothing to do with my life right now. And your point, people are hurting. This makes the Democrats very vulnerable if Republican candidates take advantage of this situation, saying, this is what I'm going to do to make your life better because these policies by Biden and the Democrats have been a failure and they're ruining the country. It's a pretty simple argument. I wish more of them would make it.
Yeah, no, Sean, I agree with you on the fact that would be advantageous for them to do. I think the thing that's been hard, because I also asked the question, well, what should the government be doing to bring down prices? And I get a lot of blank stares. Like they're not sure what can or should be done. And that's been a really intriguing thing to me, not just in Arizona, but across the board in all these states. is there's just a real uncertainty about what can be done. Because when you ask them what's causing it, they're not blaming Biden for inflation. They're blaming the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions that came out of it. They're blaming the fact that people aren't holding jobs, that they're voluntarily leaving the workforce, and that people aren't working, so it's more expensive to do things, to buy services, and so forth. And they blame Russia and the whole issue around gasoline and energy generally. So there's a lot of different people and entities they blame for why prices are high. And President Biden is not anywhere near the top of the list. So that's part of the reason I think they have a hard time saying, well, he should do A, B, and C. You'll get some people who are conscious of the energy market saying, well, we should be doing more exploration and extraction here in the U.S. But it's not a lot of people who say that. And I think Republicans, this is an opportunity on the Republican side to make some compelling cases as, well, what would you do on inflation if you were in charge? And I think that's what's not getting through to these swing voters that would be compelling if they're simple and understandable and not expensive to do. So anyway, it's an odd conversation where so many people are so obsessed with this problem, so concerned about this problem, and so lacking in an understanding about what they think should be done to address it.
Well, it does give.
They just know they're living it.
Well, it gives Republicans an opportunity to create the solution.
Exactly.
It's if you get the blank stares, it's a blank slate. Fill that void with, we're going to become energy independent again. We're the list of things.
Yeah.
That you can do.
I want to change the discussion just a little bit, and we've had a lot of news about immigration in the headlines lately. Is that rearing its head in any of your focus groups? Concern about immigration?
Barely. There's always one or two who say it's their top issue, and it's their top issue not because they want more of it, but because they want to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But it is not the key driving issue in this campaign. Not at all. I mean, again, it matters, but when I ask people, give me their top three, I get one or two votes from one or two people. It's not driving them.
Yeah, and that could be a danger for the Republicans in overplaying their hand in terms of their relentless focus on immigration. In terms of ginning up their own base.
Probably. I mean, I think that...
And that's fine.
They need to find a balance. I think here in Arizona is obviously more of an issue than in other states.
Absolutely.
Well, it was an issue in Martha's Vineyard last week. Well, for all those 50 people who got the red carpet treatment.
Yeah. And then escorted out.
Escorted to Cape Cod.
Oh, we don't actually want you here. Go away.
Oh my goodness.
I think that the governors who have sent, and our governor has sent illegal immigrants off to Washington, D.C.
And to New York.
And to New York. And Abbott's done it, and obviously DeSantis has done it. For some reason, DeSantis doing it got more attention than anyone else who'd been doing it before. So, but I don't know that really is going to impact the election. I mean, I think it exposes the left for the hypocrites that they are. But I would guess that your swing voters in the groups that you do may not even know this stuff exists because they're not seeing it they don't watch that kind of news. I don't think this is being covered on local news in North Carolina. Probably
not. I mean, the thing about this, I should share with you at some point my highlights reel of what swing voters don't know. Which I also title "You'll Want to Move to Canada After Seeing This Video." So there are things that get through. Like, they all know that Russia invaded Ukraine. They all know that Roe v. Wade was overturned. They know that Mar-a-Lago received a visit from the FBI. That they hear. But when you get into some of the legislative stuff, still little or no awareness that there's an infrastructure bill. Little or no awareness that there was this so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Virtually no understanding about the day-to-day movement of issues within Congress and sort of what's being teed up and what's being worked on. So it's very hard to break through on things that are process-oriented or even results that the administration just didn't spend enough time, at least probably from their perspective, in promoting. Mm-hmm. And it's intriguing to me that things that I look at and I go, wow, you just spent another $1 trillion on this or another $1.5 trillion on that, aren't even part of the political conversation, which to me in some ways benefits the Democrats because they can slide this stuff through. And Republicans, unless they're blaming the Democrats for this and saying it's a driver of inflation, isn't part of the larger conversation. And I think that's a golden opportunity that Republicans are missing here. I mean, to name a bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Mm-hmm. That in terms of its provisions will do nothing really in the short term to bring inflation down, is arguably a golden opportunity for Republicans to point that out.
Right.
You know, and the fact that they want to bring prices down, but in order to bring prices down, it requires you to have to buy things that you wouldn't necessarily need or want to buy, like a new dishwasher, for example.
Right.
So to me, there's yeah. I mean, we go down the list, right? I mean, certainly people who intend to buy those things will benefit from an exceedingly generous law that has incredible rebate provisions in terms of the dollars you'd get back. I recently did some focus groups on this for another client. And I saw this. Once people are aware of this, they find it almost hard to believe how generous these things are. But from a Republican point of view, that's an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's all these giveaways. And people are concerned because they know that when you give away stuff, that ultimately it raises prices and it comes out of their own pockets. And that very basic economic argument, I think, is not being made to full effect by Republicans.
Right.
No, you're absolutely right.
Agreed. So, putting on the prognosticator hat.
Oh, no.
Here we are 6.5 weeks away from the election.
Yeah.
What's your best guess? I mean, we're not going to hold you to any predictions, but do Republicans take the House? What's the range of seats, if so? And what does the Senate end up?
Oh, boy. So one of my clients sent me this morning some recent news about how Republicans seem to be bouncing back in tight races, like Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, where he seemed to be behind and now he seems to be up by a point or two. I mean, at the end of the day, ask me this the week before the election, I'll have a better sense of it.
Sure.
I think
Right.
at this point, 6-7 weeks out, it's a coin toss. It's going to be very close. I tend to be, at least I'd say in the House, I think it's still likelier to go Republican, but by a fairly narrow margin, 10 to 12 seats, maybe. In the Senate, I have this nagging feeling. It's either going to be extremely close, like it'll remain 50-50, or it'll be a sort of wave of people being fed up with either one side or the other. Mm-hmm. And it could be, you could easily see 52, 53, 54, like a mini
Either
wave.
direction.
Not 60, yeah. But it's going to, I find it sort of hard to believe that it's going to be like a splitting the difference, where some of these Democratic challengers of incumbents win and some lose. I kind of see them all kind of marching the same way. Like what happens to Rubio is likely to happen to Johnson, for example. And either they'll both win or they'll both lose.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I just have this weird feeling. And the other thing we don't know is that Kevin McCarthy's coming out, I think, tomorrow with his sort of updated version of the contract with America.
Right.
So my question is, if he polled on it, which I imagine he did because he's very conscious of public opinion research, are these things that people, like the swing voters I'm interviewing, do they really want them? Mm-hmm. Are they really supportive of these things? Are these like 90-10 type of issues that Republicans can get themselves around and swing voters, and even some Democrats around? And then, of course, once they put it out there, do they promote it? Is it seen as something that's unifying for the country?
Right.
Newt Gingrich made the contract with America. I lived through it. You lived through it. He made it a very clearly unifying, simple to understand 10-point list of all stuff that scored, 75 or 80% approval on all of it.
Right.
Is that what this looks like? Or is this stuff more complicated? Is it more intricate? Are people going to have a hard time understanding it? Are they going to even bother listening to it? I think if you're going to do this, you can't go in halfway, right? Yeah. So my question is, I plan to ask about the contents in my next focus groups, which are going to be, again, with Pennsylvania voters, different groups than I spoke to before, on October 11th. And I'm dying to ask about this.
Yeah.
Like, have you heard about this? What do you think of these things? and where do you stand on it? I think there's a huge question there.
Yeah, I think that because news consumption is so disaggregated in this day and age, it's going to be hard for him to get the kind of attention that Newt did with the contract with America. They've got a lot of television coverage at the time, but they also had it in Reader's Digest. And back then, Reader's Digest was read by tens of millions of people. Some of our listeners may not even know what Reader's Digest is.
That was a different world.
Gosh, was it that long ago?
That was a different world.
It was.
It was, but that's the other my point though,
It's
Sean.
almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was almost 28 years ago, right? But the thing about it is, we have such amazing techniques to micro target today.
Yeah.
Why isn't one party figuring out how to get a message through to the majority of these people? If I can find them for a focus group, they should be findable by either party.
They are findable.
Both.
Clearly, you're proving that they're findable.
Yeah.
Well, it's because they live in their own bubble, and they live in the bubble, as most candidates do, and we've talked about it ad nauseum in this show. They live in the bubble of their own consultants, and their own consultants are pushing something that's going to make the consultants a lot of money, and it's not about actually going out and talking to the electorate.
Yeah.
And knowing what they want and understanding what their needs are. I mean, I go back to, we had David Schweikert on here about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he told a story of going out, he does big boy polling, as he talks about it, big boy polling, and, filters through it. And then he goes out and talks to the very people that you're talking about. And guess what? These are people who've never seen Republicans before. And he's going to go talk to them. But they're innately conservative. They agree with, the issues that are important both to their families and to the country. But they've never talked to anybody before, and that's the type of thing where your focus groups and what the work that you're doing is vitally important for both sides. I mean, go talk to the people who you need to go talk to and persuade them based upon their issues and their concerns.
It's literally the people who, in close elections, will in fact make the determination of
they
who
make
wins.
the final decision.
I mean, you're talking to these people every month, Rich, and we appreciate the insight that you give us from that, because
as frightening as it is.
Yeah.
And I do want to hear that this will make you move to Canada, real.
I'll email you the clip.
Email me
you can
the
watch
clip.
it.
We can watch it. Maybe we'll even post it up there.
It'll make me weep for America,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Well, every time you see the man on the street thing, you tend to...
Oh, that was Jay Leno's Man on the Street.
Right.
It was the most brilliant thing ever.
Rich, any takeaways as we wrap this up? I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about after the election, and we can explain what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my last takeaway is that candidates matter. Candidate quality matters. And to me, that's going to be a major deciding factor with these people, because so many of them like to tell me, I don't vote the party, I vote the candidate. And if they see that the candidate just isn't able to carry his or her water, then they're likely to bail on them, even if they might agree with them on a variety of issues. And so I think it's just important, really important for your listeners to understand that if you nominate people who just are vulnerable, they're vulnerable because they don't speak well, there's an intelligence deficit, they have extreme views that are easy to exploit, that really matters in races. And we're seeing that around the country this year. And I think we have to be hyper cognizant of that fact, because it's not just swing voters voting in lockstep, because they're not lockstep voters.
No.
Right. Great. Well, thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thanks, Rich.
We appreciate your insights. We'll be watching this carefully, and we'll have you back after the dust settles, and we can kind of do the recap.
After the sawdust settles.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. It's been great.
Yeah,
Thanks so much,
appreciate
Rich.
you, and have a great one.
Take care,
You too.
everybody. We'll see you.
Bye.